On our 35th anniversary, my husband said I was his biggest regret. Our 2 daughters stood beside him. I walked out in silence, but I left behind a locked box. When he opened it, secrets he never imagined destroyed everything. Now he's begging, but someone else already knows the truth. My name is Evelyn Monroe, and I never imagined I'd be the kind of woman who walks away after 35 years of marriage. But here I am, telling a story I once thought would end very differently. I was just 27 when I married Richard Monroe. I was a registered nurse back then, working long shifts at St. David's in Austin, Texas. He was already doing well for himself, a rising star in real estate, charming, confident, and always impeccably dressed. I remember the way he carried himself, how he made people listen. I liked that about him. He made me feel safe, steady, like I could finally breathe in a world that often felt too loud. He proposed after only a year of dating. It wasn't dramatic. No fancy dinner or hidden ring. Just the 2 of us on the front porch, coffee in hand, and he said, "Let's stop wasting time. Marry me." And I did. We bought a modest house on the east side of Austin and filled it slowly. First with second-hand furniture, then with dreams, and eventually with our daughters. Amelia came first, all fire and opinions from the start. Then Sophie, quiet and watchful, always wanting to do what her big sister did. I left nursing when Amelia was born. Richard said we could manage on his income, and I agreed. I told myself I wasn't giving up my career. I was choosing something greater. A family. A future. In those early years, I found joy in the small things. Making school lunches with silly notes, baking cookies every Friday, labeling every school folder with neat handwriting. Richard worked long hours, often late into the night. When he was home, he was tired, distant sometimes, but I didn't push. I was proud to keep the house running, proud that our girls had matching socks and packed lunches, and a mother who remembered every parent-teacher conference. For a while, that was enough. At least, I told myself it was. As the years passed, Richard became more successful, and I became more invisible. He traveled often. When he came home, we'd sit in the same room but speak very little. I thought it was normal. Long marriages, I reasoned, went through these phases. Love changed shape. It matured. Right? But it was more than that. He stopped seeing me. Not in the dramatic way books describe, not through affairs or cruelty. It was more subtle. He stopped asking how my day was. Stopped noticing when I bought a new dress or changed the curtains. The only time he seemed to really speak with warmth was when talking about work or our daughters. Amelia and Sophie grew up and grew busy. College, careers, marriages. I stayed the same. The constant. The steady hand behind the curtain. And slowly, that curtain started to feel more like a wall. By the time our 35th anniversary approached, I had made peace with our quiet life. Or maybe I just stopped questioning it. I spent the week before planning a small dinner at home. I didn't want anything grand, just something simple and personal. I made lemon chicken, his favorite, and set the table with the good plates. I wore a new blue dress I'd picked up at a boutique downtown, one I thought flattered me. I even lit candles. When Richard came home, he barely glanced at the table. Just walked in, tossed his keys on the counter, and poured himself a glass of wine. No happy anniversary. No compliment, not even a smile. He sat down and picked at the food like it was any other Tuesday night. I tried to keep the conversation light. I told him about a funny thing Sophie's youngest had said on the phone earlier. I asked about his day. He grunted and stared at his plate. Then he set down his fork, looked up, and with no warning, no build-up, he said, "I've wasted 35 years with you." Just like that. I didn't even react at first. I thought I misheard. But then I looked at his face, calm, almost bored, and realized he meant it. Before I could speak, Amelia and Sophie walked into the room. They had come to surprise us for the anniversary. I thought maybe they'd make things better, that they'd hug me, ask what happened. But instead, when I told them what Richard had said, they both turned cold. "Mom," Amelia said, her arms folded. "You're always reading too much into things." Sophie, more hesitant, added, "Maybe you're just being too sensitive again." Too sensitive. Again. That night I saw it clearly. I had poured everything I had into this family, every ounce of love, patience, energy, and they had all grown comfortable with my silence. They didn't even see me anymore. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I stood up, walked to the bedroom, and packed a bag. Just a small suitcase. Enough for a few days. I didn't even know where I was going until I found myself dialing Lorraine's number. My older sister answered on the second ring. "Evelyn," she said, her voice already heavy with concern. "I need to come. I whispered. She didn't ask questions. She just said, "You're not alone anymore." It took me 10 hours to drive to Santa Fe, and the entire time I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't think. I just drove. When I pulled up to Lorraine's house, she was waiting at the door in her bathrobe, hair pulled back in a messy bun, holding a cup of tea like she'd been there all night. She didn't hug me right away. She looked me in the eyes and said, "You don't have to explain anything. You're home." That night, I slept in her guest room. I woke up only once, around 3 a.m., to the sound of coyotes in the distance. I stared at the ceiling and thought, I really did it. I left. In the morning, I sat at her kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee I couldn't bring myself to drink. Lorraine made eggs. Toast. She talked softly about the weather, the neighbors, her little garden in the back. She let me sit in silence, let me be small. It was only on the second day that she handed me a box. She placed it in front of me gently. A wooden box, worn at the corners, the kind you might find in an attic or a grandmother's closet. "Mom gave me this after she passed," she said. "Told me to give it to you when you needed it." I didn't open it right away. I just stared. The latch was stiff with age, and when I finally opened it, the smell of old paper and lavender filled the room. Inside were dozens of letters, all addressed in my handwriting. But they weren't letters I had sent. They were letters I had written to myself. Forgotten. Left behind. I picked one up, dated April 1992. Amelia was 5. Richard had just landed a major sale. I had made a cake, and he hadn't come home until midnight. I had cried alone in the kitchen, then written a letter to no one. And now I held it again. Each letter was a memory. A truth I had buried. A piece of myself I had once tried to hold on to. I looked at Lorraine. She nodded slowly. "You weren't crazy," she said. "You were surviving." I stayed silent. But something deep in my chest shifted. The woman I used to be wasn't gone. She had just been waiting, quietly, for someone to come find her. And now, I had. I spent hours that day sitting with those letters. I didn't rush through them. I didn't want to. They were like little time capsules, each one capturing a moment I had once swallowed down in silence. The handwriting shifted over the years, shaky when I was upset, neat and precise when I was pretending everything was fine. There were letters from birthdays Richard forgot, from nights I stayed up sick with worry over Amelia, from early mornings when I sat in the kitchen staring at a half-cooked breakfast wondering when I had become a ghost in my own life. I didn't even remember writing some of them. Others hit like a punch to the stomach the moment I unfolded them. One, dated July 2004, began, "I sat on the back porch today and watched the sprinkler dance over the lawn. It felt more alive than I did." I had written that while Sophie was away at summer camp and Richard was working late again. I had felt so lonely I thought I might collapse under the weight of it. But instead of saying anything, I wrote it down, folded it neatly, and tucked it away. I had buried pieces of myself one letter at a time. And now here they were resurrected. Lorraine sat across from me, silent most of the time, sometimes offering tea, sometimes just placing her hand gently on mine. That quiet support meant more to me than all the years of polite smiles and shallow reassurances I had lived through. Lorraine had always been different from me, sharp, unafraid to speak her mind, always questioning things. We had grown apart over the years, not because of anything bad, just life pulling us in different directions. But now I understood why Mom had trusted her with the box. She knew Lorraine would hold it until I was ready to face myself. One afternoon I asked her, "Did you read them?" She shook her head. "Never. They were yours. I just knew someday you'd need to see them again." There was something about that, about someone preserving your pain with care but without invasion, that felt sacred. I couldn't remember the last time I'd been treated so gently. That same week, Lorraine helped me call a financial advisor. His name was Victor, a kind man in his 70s who spoke slowly and with a calm that settled me. I told him I wanted to separate my finances, but I didn't tell him everything. Just enough. He didn't need the whole story to do his job, and I wasn't ready to bleed my soul in front of another stranger. Lorraine sat beside me during the meeting, her presence a quiet armor. Victor helped me freeze the joint accounts, open a new one in my name, and sort through the mess of paperwork I had brought in an old tote bag, bills, statements, a copy of the deed to our house. That's when the real surprise came. Victor read the paperwork and looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "Did you know the house is solely in your name?" I blinked. "No. Richard always said it was ours." He pointed to the paperwork. "It's listed under your name alone." He must have used your name for the mortgage early on when his credit was still recovering. It's been yours since the refinance 20 years ago. I stared at the papers in disbelief. All these years, I thought I had nothing. I thought I had given up everything to make someone else's life easier. But here it was in black and white, proof that not everything had been taken from me. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat back in the chair, closed my eyes, and let the truth settle inside me like warm coffee on a cold morning. When we got home that evening, Lorraine poured us both a glass of wine. We sat on her porch as the sun dipped behind the hills. "What are you going to do next?" she asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I know I'm not going back." A few days later, I filed for divorce. It felt surreal, standing in that sterile courthouse, signing papers that would end a marriage I had held onto for most of my life. The clerk looked at me like any other client, not knowing the battle I had fought just to stand upright that day. Lorraine stood next to me, arms folded, watching every move like a protective hawk. After it was done, we walked out into the bright Texas sun and sat in the car in silence. Then Lorraine reached over and squeezed my hand. "That was the hardest part," she said. I smiled faintly. I think the hardest part was staying all those years. A week later, I had my attorney deliver the notice to Richard. According to the response from his lawyer, he was stunned. He hadn't expected me to follow through. He hadn't expected me to be serious. That made me angry, not because he was surprised, but because he never once asked why. Amelia called me the next day. Her voice was sharp, tired. "Mom, what's going on?" "Dad said you filed for divorce." "I did." She exhaled loudly. "Are you really going to do this?" "I already did." "But why now? After everything?" I paused. "Because I've been quiet too long. And I'm done pretending everything's fine." There was a silence on the other end. Then she said, "Dad's a good man. He worked hard. He gave us a good life." "I gave you a good life too," I said, my voice steady. "You just didn't see it." Sophie texted me later that night. Just 2 words, "Why now?" I didn't reply. I couldn't. Because how do you explain that a woman doesn't break one day? She breaks over 1,000 days, one invisible wound at a time. I spent my evenings reading more letters. Each one gave me more clarity, more strength. I started writing new ones too. Not letters of pain this time, but of purpose. I wrote about the kind of life I wanted, the kind of peace I was chasing. They were like maps pointing toward a version of myself I hadn't met yet, but was eager to find. Then something inside me shifted. I began to want a home. Not the house I left, but a place that was truly mine. Lorraine mentioned a small cottage for sale just outside of town. Nothing fancy. A 1-bedroom place with a little patch of wildflowers out front and a kitchen that faced the hills. I drove out to see it one morning, and the moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The quiet. The possibility. I made an offer the next day. I didn't even hesitate. Richard's lawyer called shortly after. They wanted a meeting to discuss assets. We met at a neutral office. I wore a dark green blouse and held my shoulders back. Richard looked older, tired. He didn't meet my eyes when I walked in. They went over the usual bank accounts, stocks, investments. When it came to the house, his lawyer mentioned the need for an appraisal. "No need," I said. "It's mine. Has been for 20 years. Richard looked up then, shocked. "That's not true." I pulled out the paperwork Victor had given me. "It is." The lawyer stared. "Did you know about this?" Richard said nothing. I leaned forward, looked directly at him, and said, "You shouted your truth at me that night. Now I'm showing you mine." The silence that followed was deeper than anything I had ever heard. It wasn't just about the house. It was about everything he never saw, never valued, never asked about. And now, for the first time, I wasn't asking for anything. I was taking back what had always been mine. We walked out of the office separately. I didn't look back. That night, I stood in the empty cottage, boxes still sealed, and breathed. It was the first breath I'd taken in decades that didn't feel borrowed. And somewhere inside me, I knew this was only the beginning. I didn't sleep the first night in the cottage. Not because I was afraid or uncomfortable. In fact, the bed was new, the blankets soft, and the silence outside was the kind you only find far from highways and sirens. But I wasn't used to silence that didn't ache. This silence was different. It felt full, like a space waiting to be lived in, not a space screaming with what had been lost. So I lay there in bed, watching shadows from the trees dance on the walls, wondering how long it would take to feel like I belonged in my own life again. In the days that followed, I unpacked slowly. I didn't rush to fill every drawer or hang every picture. I wanted to make deliberate choices. I only brought the things I needed and a few things that meant something. My mother's old quilt, a chipped mug from the hospital where I worked in my 20s, and the box of letters Lorraine had given me. Those letters stayed on my bedside table like a lifeline, a reminder that the woman I used to be had never truly disappeared. She had just been buried under years of other people's expectations. I used to be the woman who asked everyone else what they needed before she made a move. Now, I stood in the middle of my small kitchen and asked myself, what do I want for dinner? I hadn't asked myself that in decades. I painted the walls pale yellow. Lorraine helped me on weekends, laughing when I accidentally stepped into the paint tray. She was the only person who didn't treat me like I had broken something. She treated me like I had finally woken up. One afternoon, she brought over a flyer. You should come, she said, handing it to me. It was for a weekend workshop at the local community center. A writing retreat for women starting over. Journaling, creative writing, spoken word. Normally, I would have laughed it off. Said I was too old for that sort of thing. But I looked at Lorraine, and I thought about the letters. I thought about how words had saved me, quietly in the dark. So I signed up. I walked into the retreat with my shoulders tight and my heart pounding. There were about a dozen women, all seated in a circle. Some were younger than me, some older. The facilitator, a woman named Carla, smiled like she'd known us all forever. You don't have to share anything you don't want to, she said. This space is for you. Not your spouse. Not your kids. You. That first session, we wrote about a moment we stayed silent, but wanted to scream. My hand trembled as I wrote, but I didn't stop. I wrote about our 35th anniversary. About the candles and lemon chicken. About Richard saying he'd wasted his life with me. I didn't cry. I just wrote fast and hard, like I'd been holding my breath for years. When we went around the circle, some women shared. I almost passed. But when it got to me, something pushed me forward. I stayed because I thought that's what love meant, I said quietly. But sometimes, staying is just another way of disappearing. Carla nodded. No one interrupted. And for the first time, I didn't feel foolish for telling the truth. That weekend changed something in me. I started writing every morning, not just letters but whole pages. Stories. Memories. Things I had never said out loud. Lorraine came by with groceries and found me in the living room surrounded by papers. She didn't say a word, just smiled and set down the milk. A week after the retreat, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a short letter and signed. I read some of the things you left behind. If I had known what you were feeling all those years, maybe I would have done things differently. Maybe. I'm sorry it took your silence to make me hear you. It was from Richard. I recognized the handwriting. I didn't know how he got the letters. Maybe I'd left one behind by mistake. Or maybe he found something I had meant to throw away. But I didn't feel invaded. I felt seen. A little too late, but seen nonetheless. Still, I didn't reply. Not long after, Amelia called again. Her voice was softer this time. Mom, I didn't understand what was happening, she said. I thought you were just tired. That Dad was stressed. But I didn't know it was that bad. I didn't argue. I didn't try to explain. I don't need you to fix anything, I told her. I just need you to listen, maybe for the first time. There was a long pause. Okay, she said. I can do that. I let her come visit one afternoon. She brought lavender scones from a bakery downtown. We sat on the porch, not mother and daughter, not hostess and guest, just two women trying to meet in the middle. You've changed, she said quietly. I've remembered who I was, I replied. Later that night, I wrote a letter, one I didn't fold, didn't lock away. Today, my daughter looked at me like a person again. Maybe that's the beginning of healing. Or maybe it's just a reminder that I was never crazy for wanting more. Sophie was still distant. I didn't blame her. She had always been closer to Richard, always more cautious with emotions. But I stopped chasing her. For once, I let someone come to me when they were ready. Meanwhile, life in the cottage found a rhythm. I planted rosemary and lavender near the porch. I hung wind chimes that sang softly in the afternoon breeze. I adopted a cat, a scruffy orange tabby who showed up one morning and refused to leave. I named him Tucker. He followed me everywhere, curled up next to my feet when I wrote. The silence inside the cottage no longer scared me. It felt earned now. It wasn't the silence of being ignored. It was the silence of freedom. And then, one evening as I was cleaning out an old box, I found something that caught my breath, a receipt. From a florist. Years ago. It was the same day as my 50th birthday. I remembered that day vividly. Richard came home without flowers, said he forgot. Told me birthdays weren't a big deal anymore. But this receipt showed he had ordered flowers. He just never gave them to me. I sat with that discovery for a long time. I didn't cry. I just shook my head. There's something almost cruel about withholding kindness. Not because it wasn't felt, but because it wasn't prioritized. I folded the receipt and placed it in my new journal. Not out of bitterness. Just as proof that the forgetting was a choice. One he made again and again. A few days later, I got a voicemail from Sophie. Mom, I don't know what to say anymore. I was angry. I didn't want to believe what you were saying about Dad. But I read something he showed us, one of your letters, I think. And I'm sorry. That word, sorry, was heavy in her voice. Not performative. Real. I want to see you, she added. If you'll let me. I didn't call her back right away. Instead, I sat on the porch, Tucker purring beside me, and wrote one sentence in my journal. For the first time in a long time, I am not waiting to be chosen. I choose myself. The sun was setting. The lavender swayed in the breeze. The wind chimes whispered. And I realized, I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. And finally, I was the one writing my story. The first time Sophie came to visit, she didn't bring flowers or gifts. She brought herself, quiet, nervous, uncertain. I met her at the front door of the cottage, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. I noticed the way her eyes scanned the space behind me, like she was trying to understand the world I had built without them. She looked thinner than I remembered, her face tired, like someone who had been holding their breath for too long. Hi, Mom, she said softly. Hi, sweetheart, I replied. We didn't hug right away. I stepped aside, and she came in slowly, taking in the pale yellow walls, the wooden shelves lined with jars of herbs and books, the scent of lavender drifting from the kitchen. She glanced at the writing desk in the corner, where a half-filled notebook sat open beside a cup of tea. It's peaceful here, she said. It is, I answered, and I meant it. We sat on the couch, Tucker hopping up between us like some uninvited but welcome referee. Sophie scratched behind his ears and smiled faintly. I forgot how much you always loved cats. I smiled too. I forgot how much I loved quiet. For a while we didn't speak. Just sat in the kind of silence that isn't empty, but waiting. Then Sophie finally said, I read the letter Dad gave us. I didn't know. Any of it. You didn't want to know, I said gently. She nodded. You're right. I didn't. She pulled something from her purse, a photo. The four of us, from a family trip to Colorado when the girls were still young. I was holding Sophie's hand while Richard stood beside Amelia, who was mid-laugh. I looked at the picture and saw it differently now. Not the surface joy, but the small distance in Richard's eyes. The quiet tightness in my own smile. I thought we were happy, she said, staring down at the photo. We were. Sometimes, I said. And sometimes, I convinced myself we were because I couldn't afford to believe otherwise. Sophie's eyes welled up. I was so quick to defend him. To blame you. I thought you were being dramatic. But after reading your words, I feel like I never really saw you. That's because I made sure you didn't, I told her. I thought protecting your image of our family was the same as protecting you. She wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. Was it really that bad? I looked at her, holding nothing back. It was lonely. Not because he hit me or cheated, or yelled all the time, but because I stopped mattering. Because I became invisible in the house I helped build. We didn't say much more after that. She helped me water the plants in the garden, picked rosemary and thyme with me from the little patch by the porch. We made tea and sat under the fading light of afternoon, watching the sun dip behind the hills. Before she left, she hugged me. Tightly. Longer than I expected. I don't deserve your forgiveness, she whispered. I'm not looking to punish anyone, I said. I'm just learning to live without needing to be forgiven for taking up space. That night, I slept better than I had in years. The next few weeks were quiet again, but not in a heavy way. I got into a rhythm, mornings with my journal, walks with Tucker trailing behind me like a slow shadow, evenings spent cooking for myself. I tried new recipes. I burned a few. I laughed when I did. That was new. I started a women's writing circle at the community center. Nothing formal, just a few of us who wanted to write and talk and drink tea without judgment. I didn't advertise it. Just asked Carla from the retreat if she knew anyone who might be interested. Within a week, we had 6 women. By the end of the month, 10. Each one with her own story, her own silence she was trying to unravel. And for the first time, I wasn't the one quietly disappearing in the back of the room. One morning, a letter arrived. Handwritten. No return address. But the handwriting, again, I knew it immediately. Richard. Evelyn, it began. I saw the bank records. I know about the house. I know it's yours. I know now how much I missed. How many years you gave and how little I noticed. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to say I understand now. I'm sorry I made you feel small. I read it once. Then again. Then I folded it neatly and tucked it into the back of a drawer I rarely opened. I didn't need it to mean anything. It didn't change the past. But it showed me something important. He had finally looked. Not just at the paperwork or the house or the missing routines, but at me. And he realized I was never just furniture. Never just mom or wife. I was a person. That was more than I ever thought I'd get. Amelia visited a week later. She brought books instead of baked goods and curled up on the couch like she used to when she was a teenager. I'm sorry I didn't call more, she said. You were busy. That's not an excuse. No, I said, but it's a reason. And I've stopped needing apologies to feel whole. She blinked at me. You sound different. I feel different. We spent the afternoon reading in comfortable silence. Amelia told me she'd started therapy. Said she was trying to unlearn some of the habits she'd picked up watching how her father treated me. She said that out loud. I didn't flinch. I saw you put yourself last for so long, she said. And I think I thought that was what love was supposed to look like. It's not, I said. I know that now. When she left, I felt something loosen inside me. Some old ache I didn't even realize I'd still been carrying. I started painting again. Nothing grand, just small pieces. Watercolors. Things that made me feel light. I painted the rosemary patch, a blue jay that perched outside my window every morning. Even Tucker curled up in a sunbeam. I hung them on the walls, not for anyone else but for me. Every corner of the cottage became mine. Then came the call I didn't expect. Victor, my financial advisor, called to tell me the paperwork had gone through. The house was fully transferred. All savings from the joint account, now closed, had been divided. But Richard hadn't claimed his portion. He signed it over to you, Victor said. All of it. I didn't speak for a long time. Are you okay? He asked. I think I'm more than okay, I said. He laughed. Good. That's the goal. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vengeful. I felt free. Not because I had taken something from Richard, but because I had stopped waiting for someone to give me permission to live. That evening, I took a walk down by the lake near the edge of town. The water was still. The sky pink and soft with the approaching dusk. I sat on the dock with my shoes off, toes grazing the surface, and thought about the girl I used to be. The nurse in Austin who thought love meant sacrifice. The young wife who believed staying quiet was strength. The mother who tried to be perfect so no one would notice she was falling apart. And I thought about who I was now. A woman who had found her voice in letters she once forgot. A woman who had walked away not in anger, but in truth. As the wind moved across the water, I whispered into the open air, I'm not invisible anymore. And somewhere deep in my soul I believed it. The day I burned the last letter, the sky was overcast, gray and still, like it too was holding its breath. I had read through every page, every folded line of ink I had ever written to myself in the quiet corners of my life. Some letters I could barely read through the smudges of old tears. Others were neat, composed, like a woman writing not to release pain, but to pretend it didn't exist. I knew I couldn't keep them forever. They had served their purpose. They had reminded me of who I was, and who I refused to be again. I took them outside in a metal tin, set it on the back porch, and one by one, fed the letters to the fire. I didn't cry. I didn't mourn. I watched the flames curl the edges of the paper until they turned to ash. Watching them burn felt like watching my old self be released from something, like letting go of a ghost I had kept around out of habit. The last letter was one I had written the night before I left. The ink was shaky, my handwriting uneven. It said, if I don't leave now, I will disappear completely. I held that letter a little longer than the others. Then I let it burn. I didn't need the past to hold me hostage anymore. Lorraine came by later that afternoon with a pie and a smile, her hair pulled back in her usual loose bun. You look lighter, she said, setting the pie on the counter. I think I am, I told her. We sat on the porch, eating peach pie and listening to the wind rustle through the trees. Lorraine had been my anchor through all of this, my witness when I didn't have the strength to witness myself. I often wondered how different things would have been if I'd confided in her sooner, if I'd let someone into the silence I carried for so long. But I didn't dwell. We don't get back the years we stayed quiet. We only get to decide what we do with the ones ahead. I think I'm going to use the savings to build something, I said, my fork tapping against the plate. Lorraine raised an eyebrow. Something, not just for me. 4 other women. A space. A place to write, to rest, to learn. She smiled. You've always been the one to take care of others. This time, I said, I want it to come from choice, not obligation. I found a small plot of land just a short walk from my cottage. A flat piece of earth with a few scraggly trees and a view of the hills. Nothing special to most, but I saw something there. I saw possibility. I saw a place where other women like me could come and not feel like shadows. I met with a builder named Max. He was kind, respectful, and listened to what I wanted without trying to steer me in another direction. I told him I didn't want anything fancy. Just a single open room, lots of windows, a bathroom, and maybe a small kitchen for tea and snacks. A big table in the middle. Shelves along the walls for journals and paints. A porch out front with a swing. Max sketched it out on paper, and I nodded, tears unexpectedly rising behind my eyes. This wasn't just a building. It was a beginning. I called it the Quiet House. In the meantime, I kept writing. Not just for myself anymore. I submitted a short essay to a local publication about starting over in your 60s. They published it. I received 3 handwritten letters from women I didn't know thanking me for saying things they never could. One letter from a woman named Beatrice in Flagstaff simply read, "You reminded me I'm still here." That line stayed with me. One morning, I was setting up folding chairs in the community center for our weekly writing circle when I saw Amelia walking through the door, holding a stack of notebooks. She looked nervous, like a student on the first day of class. I wasn't expecting her. "You joining us?" I asked, surprised. "I thought I'd just listen," she said. "If that's okay." "Of course," I said. She sat quietly through the session, taking it all in. At the end, she came up to me and whispered, "I want to try writing something too. I don't know where to start." "Start where it hurts," I said gently. "And write your way toward the healing." She nodded, her eyes wet. That evening, I found a note on my porch. It was Sophie. She dropped by while I was out. "Mom, I'm not great at saying things out loud yet, but I wanted you to know I'm proud of you. I see you now. I'm sorry it took me so long. Love, S." I held that note to my chest and closed my eyes. There was no grand apology, no perfect moment where everything healed at once. But I didn't need that anymore. I needed honesty. I needed effort. I needed space to exist on my own terms. And that, finally, was happening. One night, maybe a month after the first letters burned, I got a call from Richard. I debated answering it. My fingers hovered over the phone. Then curiosity won. "Evelyn," he said after I picked up. His voice sounded small. "Unsure?" "Yes." I wanted to say, "I read everything. More than just the one letter. The ones you left behind. The ones I found tucked into the back of your desk drawer. I don't know why you never told me. Why you never shouted." "I did," I said. "Just not in ways you wanted to hear." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "I didn't know how to love someone who didn't need me to fix them. You were always whole." I think that scared me. I let the silence stretch. "I'm not calling to change your mind," he continued. "I know that ship has sailed. I needed to say I see it now. I see you. I wish I had seen you sooner." I didn't cry. I didn't offer comfort. "Thank you for saying that," I said simply. He didn't ask to come back. I didn't offer him a door. That conversation wasn't about reconciliation. It was about recognition. Sometimes that's the most anyone can give. After I hung up, I stood by the window and looked out at the cottage yard. The rosemary was starting to bloom. A new season was coming. And I was ready. The Quiet House was finished in early spring. I remember walking through the door the day the builders packed up their tools and left, and standing in the center of the wide, sunlit room, I just breathed. It smelled like fresh wood and new beginnings. There were no pictures on the walls yet, no books on the shelves, no mugs in the cupboards, but it already felt full. Not with people, but with purpose. It was strange to stand inside something I had dreamed and say, I built this. Not for someone else. Not out of duty. But for myself. And for others like me. The first workshop I hosted was small. Just 5 women, 2 in their 60s, 1 in her 40s, a quiet woman in her early 70s named Joan, and surprisingly, a young mother in her early 30s who had driven all the way from Albuquerque after reading my published essay. We didn't start with writing. We started with breathing, with sitting, with saying our names out loud and not following them with who we were to someone else. No wife of, mother of, or retired from. Just names. Just selves. That day we wrote letters to ourselves. Present-day letters. No regrets. No bitterness. Just truth. Later, Joan came up to me and said, "This is the first time in 30 years I haven't felt like I had to make myself smaller just to be allowed in the room." I understood that more than I could say. And in that moment, I knew that this little space, these wooden walls, this big table, this swing on the porch, had become more than a building. It had become a sanctuary. Back at the cottage, life kept unfolding in small, lovely ways. Amelia and Sophie both visited now, not often together, but more than I ever expected. They helped me plant marigolds near the walkway. Amelia brought a set of paints and tried her hand at watercolor. Sophie sat beside me once, quietly flipping through an old cookbook of mine and asking if I remembered making buttermilk biscuits every Sunday. I did. We were slow with each other, careful. I didn't expect them to undo years of distance overnight. But I saw it in the little things. Amelia texting me to ask how the garden was coming along, Sophie sending me a photo of her own herbs growing in her kitchen window. Small bridges rebuilt plank by plank. Then one afternoon, a thick manila envelope arrived in my mailbox. No return address again, but the handwriting on the front made my chest tighten. It was from Richard. I debated leaving it sealed, but something told me to open it. Not out of hope, just closure. Inside was a letter, longer than before. Written by hand, pages folded neatly. It began simply. "I know I don't have the right to ask anything of you, but I wanted you to have this. Not because I expect forgiveness, but because I believe it's time you were seen fully." What followed was a painful, honest confession. He had read every letter I ever wrote. He'd printed them out when he found them tucked deep inside a folder labeled receipts in my old desk. He didn't expect to feel anything, he said. But he had. He'd read them late at night after we separated, trying to understand why I had changed. He had seen, through my words, the woman he had stopped choosing year after year. And for the first time, he admitted it was never that I stopped trying. It was that he stopped noticing. Asterisk, "You gave so quietly," he wrote, "that I convinced myself I was the one carrying us." Then came something that stopped me in my tracks. A legal statement, signed and witnessed. He had transferred full ownership of our old home, and the remaining investments solely into my name. "You gave everything," he wrote. "I gave up noticing it. So now I give this, not because I think it fixes anything, but because it's the only way I know how to let go with honesty." I set the pages down, my fingers trembling, not from sadness, but from the quiet shock of being seen too late. I didn't call him. I didn't send a letter in return. Instead, I walked outside into the fading light of day, sat on the porch swing at the quiet house, and closed my eyes. The wind moved gently through the trees, and I imagined a version of myself from years ago, standing in a kitchen that always felt too silent, holding a plate of food that would go cold, writing letters just to remember I existed. I wanted to tell her she'd make it here. I wanted to tell her she wouldn't always be waiting for someone to choose her. Not long after that, Grace, one of the women from the retreat, asked if she could bring her teenage daughter to the next workshop. She said the girl had been struggling, hiding in silence, unsure of how to talk to anyone. I said yes. That Saturday, the girl sat quietly beside her mother, notebook open but blank for the first 30 minutes. Then, slowly, she began to write. Later, she folded the page and handed it to her mom. Grace's eyes filled with tears as she read it. She looked at me and mouthed, "Thank you." That night, I wrote in my journal for the first time in weeks. Not about pain, not about loss, but about impact. Maybe the letters I wrote in secret weren't wasted. Maybe they were waiting for someone else to find them, someone who needed to know they're not alone. Spring melted into summer. The herbs grew fuller, the cottage felt warmer, and the swing on the porch became my favorite place to sit at the end of the day. One evening, Sophie stayed late after dinner. She helped me do the dishes, and afterward, we sat outside watching fireflies blink through the garden. She turned to me and asked, "Do you ever regret not leaving sooner?" I thought about it. Sometimes, I admitted. But if I had, maybe I wouldn't be here. Maybe I wouldn't have this. Or you. She nodded slowly. "I'm glad you're here now." I smiled. "So am I." And that was enough. Not everything needed fixing. Not every wound needed a perfect healing. But for the first time in decades, I felt whole. And I was no longer afraid of the silence. There's something strange about peace when you've lived so long without it. It doesn't come with fanfare. It doesn't arrive like a storm. It seeps in quietly, like sunlight through half-closed curtains. That's how it was for me. One day I realized I hadn't cried in weeks. I hadn't woken up dreading the silence. I hadn't needed to justify my existence through someone else's comfort. I was simply living. and I was content. The quiet house had become more than I ever dreamed. Every week, women gathered there, some with shaking hands, some with brave words, some with years of silence tucked behind their ribs. We sat at the big wooden table, notebooks in front of us, and peeled back the layers of our lives, one page at a time. We cried. We laughed. We shared stories we had once believed would stay buried forever. And every time someone said, "I've never told anyone this before," I saw a new thread of healing being sewn into the air. One evening, after the group had gone home, I sat alone by the window. The room still held the energy of what had been shared: grief, strength, truth. I looked around at the place I had built with the pieces of my own brokenness, and I smiled. This wasn't just a writing space. It was a resurrection. That night, I walked back to my cottage under a sky full of stars. Tucker trotted behind me like he always did. I stood outside for a while, watching the wind move through the rosemary and lavender. It was the same wind that had once whispered through the old house in Austin, through the cold spaces between Richard and me. But here it didn't sound hollow. It sounded alive. The next morning I got a call from Lorraine. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice bright. "Why don't we take a trip? Just the two of us. Somewhere you've always wanted to go." I laughed. "You mean now that I've officially rebuilt my life?" "Exactly. What better way to celebrate?" I paused, imagining us, two older women with a rental car and no one to answer to, driving along winding roads with windows down and music playing. "You know what? Let's do it." We made plans for late summer. A road trip through Oregon, stopping by the coast, staying in tiny inns, drinking coffee in quiet corners. It felt like a reward, not just for surviving, but for choosing not to stay hidden. A few days later, I stood in the old house one last time. Richard had called and asked if I wanted to pick up the last of the boxes. He said he'd be out of town, that he'd leave the door unlocked. I almost didn't go, but part of me needed to see it again, not as my home, but as something I'd let go of. The place was smaller than I remembered. The paint faded, the garden overgrown. The dining table where I'd served countless meals sat dusty and forgotten. I walked through the rooms slowly, my steps quiet on the worn wooden floors. It wasn't sadness I felt, it was detachment. I had already said goodbye to this place in my heart long ago. In the attic, I found one last box with my name on it. Inside were a few old photo albums, a cookbook with scribbled notes in the margins, and a framed picture of Richard and me on our wedding day. I looked at the photo, my eyes so full of hope, his smile so confident. I didn't feel angry. I felt grateful that I had once believed in something, even if it hadn't lasted the way I thought it would. I left the picture behind. As I turned to leave, I paused in the doorway. The air smelled like dust and something faintly sweet, like memories. I whispered, "Thank you for the lessons," and closed the door behind me. That was the last time I ever stepped into that house. Back home, I started planning the expansion of the quiet house. We had outgrown the space. I wanted to add a small garden, a meditation deck, a few cozy nooks where women could read or just be still. I used part of what Richard had signed over to fund it, not as revenge, but as restoration. I was turning history into something useful. Amelia and Sophie helped with the planning. They came by on weekends, sat with the architect, offered ideas. Our relationships weren't perfect, but they were honest now. I didn't pretend, and they didn't expect me to. That was more healing than anything else. One Saturday, we hosted an open house. Women from the community came by to see the space, share tea, and hear readings from our group. I stood near the back, watching others take the stage. Joan, now writing poetry for the first time in her 70s, Grace's daughter, who had written a short story about courage, and even Amelia, who read a letter she had written to herself. When it was my turn, I didn't prepare anything elaborate. I simply stepped up, held the mic, and said, "For a long time, I thought I had to be silent to be strong. That love meant giving everything and asking for nothing. But I've learned that true strength is knowing when to walk away. True love is not losing yourself to keep others comfortable. And peace is finding your voice and using it, even if it shakes." The room was silent. Then came applause, not loud, but full of something deeper. Understanding. That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone in the garden. The wind was cool, the stars out again. I pulled out my journal, no longer hidden, no longer written in secrecy, and wrote the last entry I would ever write in that book. I used to wait to be chosen. Now I choose myself. I used to write to survive. Now I write to be free. I didn't walk away to end a story. I walked away to begin one. I closed the journal, stood up, and breathed in the night air. I wasn't a wife anymore. Or just a mother. Or just someone who stayed behind the scenes. I was Evelyn Monroe, a woman who had learned how to be whole, even after the pieces were scattered. And I had never felt more alive.